As Ian said, today I'm going to be talking about the importance of selectivity and maximizing selectivity for your separations. And one approach, one method you can do this is through using complementary stationary phase chemistries. And today I'm going to discuss some of these different types of phase chemistries and their mechanisms of interaction. And also I'm going to show some examples and data of how we can use different stationary phases to achieve the separation that we're after in a quick and efficient manner. So before we get into the main part of the webinar, I'm always very interested in the audience, and I'd like us to begin with a very short poll discussing on whether you do method development. So hopefully now you should have options in front of you on the screen if the technology is working correctly, and you can please register your different votes, and then this will allow us to collect some useful data and also make sure we discuss the right elements of the information and get that to you. And obviously collect the data too, which is always useful to understand our audience and some of the challenges that you're facing. So I'll just give it another second or two, and then I will close the poll. So it looks like we've got a very high response rate, so thank you for clicking on the different options there. I will close the poll now, and we can continue with the presentation. So on with the show. So first of all, I'm going to discuss what selectivity is, just so that we all have a very clear understanding when I say the word selectivity, exactly what I mean. So the classical description of selectivity, and I'm going to talk about some different method development approaches. Method development is the exciting part of chromatography. Lots of people enjoy doing method development, and it is one of the highlights of the separation scientist's job. But of course, there's lots of different ways to do method development, which is also very good because it makes it interesting for us in the lab when we're developing our separations and trying to resolve those difficult analytes from each other. Now, depending upon the type of chemistry you use, you can actually maximize selectivity through the different mechanisms of interaction. So I'm going to speak briefly about how we design different types of stationary phases and how it's possible to design different types of stationary phases to give us improved or increased selectivity with different types of analytes. And then I'm going to talk about one possible way that we can try and efficiently develop methods. So this is a very simple slide on selectivity, and if you look in various textbooks that we've all read and referred to, and even if you Google chromatography and selectivity, this is the type of information that you will see. You can see that selectivity is denoted by the symbol alpha, and we can see quite clearly, and hopefully again the technology is working now, when we have a little laser pointer on the screen, you can see that alpha is the ratio of retention factors for two adjacent peaks. And peak selectivity can be thought of as peak spacing. Sometimes people call it the separation factor or the separation selectivity between adjacent peaks. So when I refer to selectivity, this is the description that I have in my mind. Now, of course, this isn't a theoretical talk. There's lots of practical, useful data in here, but there is some theory that it's important to understand. And we can see here that this is one form of the resolution equation, and it has three components: an efficiency component, a selectivity component, and a retention component. And when we look at this equation, it is difficult to try and understand which part of this equation is the most powerful with respect to resolution, because of course resolving compounds from each other is the goal of why we typically are doing method development. When we look at this equation in a graphical format, so now we can see we have resolution on the y-axis, and then we have selectivity or alpha, efficiency, the number of plates, n, and retention factor, k, on the x-axis. And we can see quite clearly that selectivity is very powerful with respect to resolution. So anything we do in our method development activities that maximize selectivity also maximizes resolution for us. So selectivity is a very useful parameter. So I think it's fair to say that selectivity is the key to resolution in chromatography. And of course, some of the other parameters such as efficiency help boost performance. Now we know that selectivity is the most powerful term in the resolution equation. Which factors affect selectivity? Well, in fact, many of the different parameters, mobile phase parameters and other types of parameters that you can change and modify in your method development on your instrumentation and your mobile phase and your stationary phase and so on, have an impact on selectivity. However, the most important thing to understand is that not all factors affect selectivity to the same amount. So we can see here, for instance, under isocratic separations, these parameters are in a list format. So the parameters at the top, the type of stationary phase, or what I mean here is the mechanisms of interaction, the pH of your mobile phase, and the type of organic solvent or organic modifier that you use are really influential with their impact on selectivity. And some of the other parameters that are listed here have an impact on selectivity, but not to the same degree. Now for gradient separations, of course, the parameters on the left are important, but there are some specific parameters that can affect selectivity in a gradient dilution chromatography. So for instance, we have the gradient steepness, we have the apparent K, the apparent retention in gradient chromatography according to this equation here, Tg the gradient time, F flow rate, and then we have here the gradient range, the column volume, and a constant depending on your analyte molecular weight. The dwell volume of your system in gradient chromatography can affect selectivity, and this is a very common challenge that people find when they develop a method on one instrument and then they move the method to a different instrument or to a partner lab, or they outsource the method and they begin to see differences in their chromatography. And it's quite common for that to be differences in dwell volume of the instrumentation. And this is a topic all on its own. I have a whole separate talk on this topic just on itself, and how you can account for dwell volume and make sure you get exactly the same chromatography on a receiving system as the originating system. But that's not the topic for today. And then, of course, column dimension can affect selectivity as well. If we change the column dimensions, we change VM term here, we therefore change K star, and we change K star 2 over K star 1, so we change alpha as well. So all of these different parameters affect selectivity, but these parameters over here are the most powerful parameters with respect to maximizing selectivity for our separations. So how do we do method development? As I said before, there's lots of different ways to do method development, and it is typically multivariate. Many people will do some method development and they will look at different gradients. They'll maybe change the temperature of their instrumentation. Possibly they'll look at pH or buffer concentrations. So all of these different parameters people can change and modify when they're looking to try and develop a suitable separation. Now on the screen you can see here 5 boxes, and we could call this a one factor at a time approach to method development. So here we can see the first box. This is a typical reverse phase method development system. It has one column in it, which is normally a C18 column, operated at one temperature for one broad gradient range, at one pH, normally acidic pH, with one organic modifier, which is normally acetonitrile or methanol. So an analyst will typically do some broad scouting gradient runs, and they will look at their chromatography and try and decide if they're happy with the resolution of their compounds and the separation, and then their method development can move into optimization, or maybe they're happy at that point with their method. Now, if you do some initial gradient runs and you don't get the separation you're interested in, what are your options? Well, you could look at lower temperatures and higher temperatures, for instance. You can look at different solvents. you can look at different types of column chemistries. I've listed some different groups of chemistries here. We have alkyl chain-based chemistries, aromatic-based chemistries, and polar embedded and polar interaction type chemistries. And then finally, we can also look at pH, low, mid, and high pH. Some separation scientists are very interested in looking at different pHs for their separations to try and optimize maybe retention and or peak shape. Now at this point, I think we can see here that I've listed the 3 different groups of column chemistries, and by far the most typical column chemistry is C18. So in many different market sectors or application areas and all around the world, the C18 column is the most popular stationary phase, and that's for a number of reasons. It's very reproducible, column to column and batch to batch. You get reasonable lifetimes with C18 columns, and many people, their first separations are always typically performed on a C18. Now I've only got 3 poles that I want to run, but at this point I'd like to run the second pole so that I can try and understand what type of column chemistries that you use before we continue with the presentation. So as I said, from my understanding, as most people use C18s, but I'm very interested to see if people use where the split in the audience is, and if people use other types of column chemistries regularly on a frequent basis. Maybe for your application areas, you have a particular different type of chemistry that's not a C18 that you use. So I'll just run this poll just for a few more seconds, and then I can continue with the presentation. Okay, so thank you to everybody who's responded to the poll. So I'll close that poll now and continue. So most people use a C18, which is the outcome of the poll, which I'm pleased about because that's my understanding, talking to many different people in many different companies and areas too. But we can see the 3 different groups I have here. We have the alkyl chain-based chemistries. These are based and dominated by hydrophobic interactions. This is the main mechanism of interaction. With aromatic type phases, we typically have low hydrophobicity, and we introduce other types of mechanisms such as pi-pi interactions, and also there can be some dipole interactions as well from polarizable functionalities. And then finally we have polar interaction and polar retention type phases for reverse phase, and here we have, for instance, polar embedded type phase, C18 amide, which can give us a different type of selectivity compared to the other different stationary phases. Now, of course, when we're doing method development, there are lots of possible runs that we could do, lots of injections we could make to understand the retention behavior of our analytes with these different variables. But of course, this all takes a lot of time. We have to stand in front of the instrument, program the methods, program the sequence, equilibrate between these different conditions if we're varying different things, and then collect the data, interrogate, interpret the data, and decide what we should do next. So of course, from a method development perspective, it makes sense if we can reduce some of these parameters and maybe just focus on those high impact variables. And the purpose of this talk today is to describe how we can use different column chemistries, or more accurately different mechanisms of interaction, to help us maximize selectivity and to develop our methods in a more efficient and productive manner. Now, from a stationary phase design perspective, there's lots of different ways to make different types of stationary phase, and you can see on the screen there we have a simple aromatic ring, and if we substitute onto this aromatic ring different types of functionality, and here I've got listed some different types of electron donating groups, then we change the properties of that ring system, and we can see here we generate a weak dipole across the ring, and also we generate a slightly more electron-rich or electronegative ring system through this substitution of this alkyl chain. Now we can of course do the opposite to that, and we can substitute electron withdrawing groups onto the ring system. And here we have the classic pentafluorophenyl arrangement, the so-called PFP columns, which are very nice and give a very different selectivity for many different separations. This has a moderate dipole across the ring because of those 5 fluorines substituted across the ring system. And of course we have a small alkyl chain here as well, which allows us to attach the ligand to the silica surface, so that we can produce the stationary phase chemistry. Now, with the ACE materials, what we've done is created a C18 based chemistry. So we have the robustness and stability of the C18 material together with the hydrophobic interaction mechanism and the phenyl ring system together in a single stationary phase. This should allow us to maximize selectivity because we have multiple modes of interaction. We have hydrophobicity, we have weak dipoles and pi-pi interactions as well, all in a single stationary phase. And the C18 PFP is a similar type of design approach. We have the C18 chemistry together with the pentafluorophenyl ring arrangement together in a single stationary phase. And these columns, these chemistries have been developed to give multiple modes of interaction, to give low bleed. So the bleed profiles of these columns are the same as a standard C18, which is useful for gradient analysis and also useful for LCMS type applications. But also these columns are 100% wettable. And by that, what I mean is that these columns can be operated at 100% aqueous or 0% organic solvents. Now, most C18 columns will require 3 or 4% of organic solvent in the mobile phase to make sure there's no pore dewetting or phase collapse. But if you have polar components, polar analytes in your stationary, samples, and you need to retain them, and even with low amounts of organic solvent, you still have poor retention, then your options are limited. But with these type of stationary phases, you can drop to a 0% organic solvents and try and retain those polar species. So these types of columns are very useful for a broad range of samples and different analyte polarities. Now, of course, that all sounds good from a materials perspective, but we are chromatographers. So what does this look like for chromatography? Well, this is a simple example with non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, and we can see the central chromatogram here shows a standard ACE C18 separation. So this is dominated by hydrophobic interactions, reasonable peak shape, and we can see the elution order of the components. Now with a short chain phenyl, we can see we get a different elution order because we have a different mechanism of interaction. We have a low amount of hydrophobicity and we have some pi system interactions, and we can see that all of the analytes elute a little bit faster compared to the C18 as well. Now if we combine the mechanisms from the phenyl here and the mechanism from the C18 into a single stationary phase, we can see we have the hydrophobicity of a C18, but we have the different selectivity provided by the aromatic group from the phenyl stationary phase. So we have a column chemistry that combines these different mechanisms together. So this gives us a different option for our method development. Now for the C18 PFP, here in this particular example, we have the conditions and the analytes names are down here, and we can see these are small, closely related compounds. So these are methoxybenzene isomers. So these are regioisomers or positional isomers. We have the trimethoxy isomers. We also have the dimethoxy isomers in this mixture too. And we can see that with a standard C18, we get coelution, which is what we would expect. Now with a short chain PFP, we can see here, this is the thermo PFP product, and we can see we get a pretty reasonable separations, almost completely resolved all of the analytes. So you can see how that PFP group is giving us a very different interaction and mechanisms of separation compared to a standard C18 in the top chromatogram. Of course, if we bring bring both of those together in the C18PFP stationary phase, we have the hydrophobicity of a C18, we have the aromatic and pi system interactions from the pentafluorophenol arrangement, and so we get the best of both of these column chemistries together in a single stationary phase. You can see that the retention window, the pointer from the first peak to the last peak, is broad. We get good selectivity and good resolution and separation of these closely related compounds. So this is a nice example where we bring together the benefits of both of these types of stationary phase into a single column chemistry. Now, polar embedded phases, of which this is an example from a phase design perspective, we can see here there's an embedded amide group, and then we have a hydrophobic tail providing a hydrophobic interaction. The difference with this polar embedded chemistry is that this spacer, alkyl spacer chain, is slightly longer, giving us more stability for this stationary phase. And in fact, this polar embedded phase is stable in phosphate at pH 7 at 60 degrees for 30 days. So it's a very stable chemistry, low bleed profile, but it gives a very different selectivity compared to the phases I've already discussed. And then this particular chemistry here is a stable cyano column. So many cyano columns are propyl terminal nitrile, propyl cyano. So there's 3 carbons, and then the stationary phase is attached to silica. By making this carbon chain a bit longer, as you can see in this diagram, we increase the stability of the stationary phase, so the bleed is reduced, but we still get the interaction and the mechanisms from the cyano functionality. We also increase the hydrophobicity of the stationary phase, so that the weighting of that mechanism becomes higher too. So we get multiple modes of interaction. And again, these phases are 100% aqueous compatible, so for polar analyte retention. And this is a good example which shows under the same conditions a separation of these small polar polyhydroxy compounds and polyhydroxy aromatics on a standard C18, where they are eluting near the solvent front and co-eluting together. Under the same conditions with the C18 amide, we have a very different separation, different mechanisms of interaction, and we get a very nice resolution of all the components in our sample. And the final phase I wanted to mention is a stable C18 column with a wide pH range, an extended pH range. Sometimes pH can be a useful parameter to explore in method development or separations, but it's important you have a chemistry that is stable under different conditions. And the super C18 is stable between pH 2 and pH 11. And so you're able to explore a low, mid and high pH range for those particular tricky samples that you might get that may be separated better or have better peak shape at mid or high pH. The super C18 is a very inert column. So this is a very high performing stationary phase. The peak shape is excellent. It's one of the best that we've tested. How do people use these different types of super C18 columns or extended pH stable columns? Well, this is one example here where we have 11 components separated at low pH and using ammonium formate. And then we can switch on the same column to high pH using ammonium hydroxide at pH 10.7. And you can see we get a different elution order and a very different selectivity for the separation. Of course, across such a wide pH range, when our analytes gain or lose protons, their polarity changes and their retention changes significantly in reverse phase chromatography. So we have here, for example, compounds being retained more or retained less as we move across the pH range. Just for your information, if there is further specifications or information on the columns that you need, I've included here the specification sheet. And perhaps what's most useful is this column over here, which tells you which of the columns are 100% aqueous compatible if you need to retain polar compounds. And there's a very nice list here of the different types of phases and functionalities and the different availabilities and properties of these chemistries. So we talked a lot about the different chemistries, and the C18 is the most popular phase that people use. And as I said, this is dominated by the mechanism hydrophobic interactions. Now, it's possible for us to actually determine the weighting of different mechanisms with different column chemistries. So we use the Tanaka protocol, which was published about more than 20 years ago now. And in this particular protocol, you take very simple probes, you analyze them on different column chemistries, and then you can determine the weighting of different mechanisms that are present. So for instance, we can determine the amount of hydrophobicity, whether pi system interactions are available, whether there's dipole-dipole interactions, hydrogen bonding, and also shape selectivity. So if we look at a standard C18, for instance, we can see it is dominated by hydrophobic interactions. So more stars means that mechanism has a higher weighting for that column chemistry. Of course, a standard C18 column has no aromatic groups, so there's no pi-pi interactions. It has no polarizable functionality, so there's no dipole-dipole interactions. There's a small amount of hydrogen bonding, which is provided by the silica surface, and also there's a little bit of shape selectivity, which most people don't realize with standard C18 columns. And this is provided by the fact that the analyte can move between the C18 ligands, and you can get some discrimination of analyte shape. Now, of course, when we're doing method development, we want to maximize selectivity, so it makes sense to use different mechanisms to help us with our separation. And so the different chemistries that I've talked about today have been designed to give different weightings of mechanisms to help us with our method development in reverse phase chromatography. So this makes it an ideal screening platform for our separations. So if we look at the different selectivities, we can see that they are complementary to each other. So we have different chemistries with different mechanisms, providing different interactions with our analytes, maximizing the selectivity of our separation to help us develop the method more productively. And in fact, the approach that we use in the lab that I work in is we have the 6 different chemistries you can see here, and we actually use 2 solvents, the protic solvent methanol and the aprotic solvent acetonitrile. So we actually have a 6-column, 2-solvent method development platform. And this is our standard approach that we use for all method development activities. So if we consider the workflow that I showed earlier, we can see now instead of having multiple boxes, 5 boxes or more boxes, we have 2 boxes. We have a box for different mechanisms of interaction, different column chemistries, and we have a box for different solvents, acetonitrile and methanol. So this allows us to explore the selectivity space with chemistry and solvent combinations, and this is an effective way to do method development. It is a semi-automated approach because the instrument is set up and it allows us to screen through the different columns with our sample mixtures and then assess the data to understand whether we have a method development method already developed from the screen, or whether we take one of the combinations and we do further optimization. So here we can see a picture of the instrument that is used in my lab, and we can see we have a UHPLC instrument as our platform. There is a switching valve in the column oven here with the 6 different columns that we use, one for each of the different chemistries. Now the column dimensions that we use are 100 by 3 millimeter 2 micron. We found this to be the best compromise of robustness of the platform with speed of screening through the columns and the solvents to give us our data. So as an overview of method development using this screening platform type approach, we typically do scouting runs with general starting conditions, and then we do optimization. Then potentially, depending on who we're working with, we may do validation and then implementation or transfer of the method. So this is a general overview of method development. Our first approach is to always perform broad scouting gradient runs, and if we don't have any further information on the sample, then we would typically use an acidic pH. So this would be ammonium formate at pH 3. How do you calculate your starting conditions? So the gradient and so on, the flow rate, well, this depends on the instrument you're using, the maximum pressure, and of course your column dimensions. So this is where this equation comes in handy. So we solve this equation for K star of around 2 or 20. Some people say 5 or 10. It really does depend on you and your lab. You can solve this equation because you have all of the data for these different variables, and then that produces your starting conditions. So the example I want to share with you is a relatively straightforward example. It's for a related substances method development activity. So the parent compound is going to be this component here, which is paracetamol or acetaminophen as it's known in some countries. And we have 9 other impurities and degradation products in this sample mixture. Now, because paracetamol is so well known, the structures are very well known. This compound is more than 40 years old. We know the structures. We also know some of the physicochemical data very well too. Much of this is in books or in databases online. So you can see here we know the ionization constants. We also know the log P or lipophilicity values, and also we can either calculate or determine the log D values, which is the distribution of different forms at different pHs. Now, whenever we begin method development, if we have this information, it's always important to assess your sample mixture to make sure your experimental conditions are appropriate. Now, when we look at the data that we have for this particular mixture, one of the compounds stands out very clearly. 4-aminophenol is actually an interesting compound. It has a negative log P, so this means it is very hydrophilic. It is very water-liking, water-soluble, and it elutes very quickly in reverse phase chromatography. In fact, it elutes on the T0, on the dead volume of the run under acidic conditions, which is not ideal, of course. We need to retain compounds so that we can integrate them and quantify them. However, if we look at the log D data here, we can see that as the pH increases, then the values actually go from negative to positive. So this means that if we increase the pH of our mobile phase, we're more likely to get retention of this compound in a reverse phase separating system. And so for this reason, I use this example, whereas normally all of our scouting runs are done at pH 3 using ammonium formates. In this example, we use ammonium acetate at pH 6. So this would allow us to retain the very polar 4-aminophenol. So we make up the sample, we mix it, we filter it and put it on the instrument. The columns are in the changer, in the switcher and ready to go, and we press go on the sequence and we walk away. And the system is designed to give us, within a working day, 2 sheets of paper of results on the printer at the end. We have 6 chromatograms in acetonitrile and 6 chromatograms in methanol. The typical protocol is that we do some blank injections, so the columns are equilibrated, and then we do a couple of injections of the sample mixture. Then we move to the next column and we repeat, first of all in one solvent and then in the second solvent. So these are the real data from the instrument. So these are the chromatograms, and we can see here the different column chemistries: C18, the C18AR, C18PFP, super C18, the polar embedded column, and the stable cyanophase. So if we look at the data, first of all, I should highlight peak 2 here is 4-aminophenol. So we can see it is just about retained. The K is still very low, but it's suitably retained that we can integrate and quantify it. If we look at peak pairs 1 and 4, we can see here, as I've highlighted with the green box, we can see that they are co-eluting in the first chromatogram. 4 is on the tail here of paracetamol, the parent compound, co-eluting with the PFP, co-eluting with the super C18. 4 actually elutes before the parent compound with the polar embedded phase. So the different mechanism of interaction giving us a different retention profile. And then finally, the cyano-ES phase, we can see that compound 4 elutes just about off the tail of the main peak. Now, peak pairs 7 and 8, we can see are well separated on the first 4 columns. So the selectivity is very good, the separation is very good. When we get down to the 5th column, we can see with the polar embedded phase, we get a switch around in the elution order. So again, the different mechanisms giving us a different interaction and retention behavior. And also with the stable cyano phase, the peaks are closer together, but they're still separated, but they are eluting in the reverse order. So the different column chemistry giving us a different selectivity. And then finally, peak pairs 9 and 10, we can see are slightly co-eluting, separated, slightly co-eluting, and then the last 2 phases, they are very well separated. So the different chemistries providing us with slightly different profiles and different retention and elution orders depending on the column chemistry. If we look at the number of peaks that are separated in our mixture, we can see that we have, where the green ticks are, 2 options: the C18 amide, the polar embedded phase, and the stable cyano column, the cyano ES. Both of these 2 columns have provided complete resolution of all the compounds from the mixture. So from the screen, we have an option of a method without any further method development. And perhaps the most important thing about this slide is the red box, because most people, as we saw from the poll and from talking to many different separation scientists, most people would start with the C18 column. So then you can see there are 2 areas of concern. There is a co-elution with peak 1 and 4 and co-elution with 9 and 10. So then the chromatographer must begin further optimization and method development, whereas using a screening approach based around selectivity and the column chemistry interactions, we have 2 options with this methanol solvent. Now, the second set of data, I won't spend quite as long talking about this, but we can see here, again, the different column chemistries. We can see that peak 2 is retained away from the T0, which is good. And we can see, again, differences in the chromatography. So with the first C18 column separated on the tail, separated, co-eluting, and well separated. 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 are a little bit different on this particular phase because peaks 8 and 9 begin to co-elute together. But if we look again, as I did on the previous slide, at the number of column chemistries using acetonitrile as the organic solvent, where we have complete separation, there are now 4 options. So 4 options in acetonitrile and 2 options in methanol, so 6 potential options where we have complete separation of the components in this mixture. And again, just to reiterate the point, here with the C18 we would have had co-elution of peaks 8 and 9, so we need to do further method development to separate these compounds so we can have our final method. First of all, selectivity really is helpful in chromatography. Hopefully you've seen from the theory I presented, which is sound chromatography theory, but also some of the practical data and the different mechanisms of interaction. Selectivity really is our friend in chromatography. It helps us develop methods more productively. Because we understand selectivity, and of course all of you now are experts in selectivity, this means we can focus on those high impact variables, mechanisms of interaction, different types of organic modifiers, and together this type of screening platform can be really useful for your method development activities. I talked a bit about phase design and how we can put different types of chemical functionalities together, which help us give different mechanisms to help us try and resolve analytes in our mixtures from each other. And of course, I talked about the column screen and how this, I think, is a really useful platform for semi-automated method development. And based on the column screen, I presented this method development platform, which is the one that we use in our lab, and it's based on selectivity. That's the most important point I wanted to get across. With that, I would like to thank you for listening to me this afternoon. I hope there's been something useful in there for you. Some of the resources I hope will also be valuable to you. And hopefully you got good answers to the questions as well as they were coming in on the GoToMeeting software. So I want to say thank you to VWR for allowing me to talk to you today. And I'll pass back to the moderator for further comments. Thank you very much.